Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepy Crimes Hub. I'm here with you tonight to help you relax and slowly fall asleep. I know many of you are watching this video to rest your mind, so before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you like, take a deep breath and let go of the day. Let's gently begin with case 1. Picture Brooklyn in the mid-1940s crowded sidewalks. The smell of the ocean drifting in from the docks, and tight rows of brick houses packed with families who carried old world secrets into the new world. On March 12, 1945, in Bensonhurst, a baby boy named Salvatore Gravano was born into that atmosphere, a neighborhood where respect meant everything, and reputation could follow you for life. He was the youngest in the family, growing up in a household that had already experienced loss before he ever opened his eyes. 2 siblings had died before he was born, and that shadow lingered quietly in the background of his childhood. His parents, Gerlando Jerry Gravano and Caterina Kate Gravano, were immigrants shaped by hardship, survival, and ambition. They had crossed oceans and borders, each carrying their own version of the American dream, but also their own connections to a darker reality. Caterina had arrived from the southern Italian region of Apulia as a young girl, adapting to a new country while holding tightly to her traditions. Jerry's story was far more dramatic. Born in 1901, he didn't simply immigrate. He slipped into North America by jumping ship in Canada, later making his way into the United States with help from his older brother, Alfonso. And Alfonso was no ordinary relative. During Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal across America, he had already become deeply involved in bootlegging. He wasn't just running small operations. He was part of a powerful smuggling network known as the Sunset Fleet, transporting liquor through the Hudson River and New York waterways under the cover of darkness. The shipments flowed quietly into places like the Fulton Fish Market, then into hidden speakeasies across the city. On the West Coast, routes stretched down from Canada into Oregon. Alfonso wasn't just connected. He was a made member of the Sicilian Mafia, fully initiated into a secret brotherhood that operated beyond the law. And even though little Sammy grew up in a household that looked stable on the outside, those connections were never far away. Jerry worked honestly as a painter, helping build and color the rapidly expanding neighborhoods of New York. Later, he and Caterina opened a small dress factory, where Caterina's skill as a seamstress helped maintain a decent standard of living for the family. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable. Discipline was strong in that home. Work ethic was expected. But in Bensonhurst, the line between legitimate success and organized crime was often thin, sometimes invisible. From a young age, Salvatore wasn't even called by his real name. A relative once joked that he looked like his uncle Sammy, and the nickname Little Sammy stuck. Over time, that name replaced Salvatore completely. But the name that would truly define him came later, and it came from the streets. At just 13 years old, Sammy joined a local gang called the Rampers. It wasn't unusual in Bensonhurst. For many boys, the streets were their training ground. One afternoon, when older kids stole his bicycle, Sammy refused to let it go. Instead of backing down, he confronted them. The fight that followed wasn't balanced. He was smaller, younger, outnumbered, but he didn't hesitate. He charged at them, swinging wildly, taking hits but giving them back just as fiercely. From a nearby cafe, local mafia figures watched the scene unfold. They saw something in him. Not fear, not hesitation, but raw aggression and pride. The men intervened and made sure the bicycle was returned. And as Sammy walked away, battered but victorious, one of the made men reportedly said he fought like a bull. It wasn't just a comment. It was a prediction. From that moment on, the nickname the Bull began to follow him, a name that hinted at the force he carried inside, the kind that doesn't retreat, doesn't negotiate, and doesn't forget. And in a neighborhood where power was admired and violence earned respect, that reputation was more than just a label. It was the first step toward a future that would pull him deeper into one of the most dangerous criminal worlds in America. But behind that tough street image, there was another side of Sammy that few people saw, a frustrated, struggling kid who never quite fit inside classroom. He suffered from dyslexia at a time when learning disorders were barely understood. Instead of help, he was labeled. Teachers called him slow. He fell behind, not because he lacked intelligence, but because words on a page refused to stay still for him. The bullying came quickly. Classmates mocked him. Authority figures underestimated him. He was held back twice, once in the 4th grade and again in the 7th. And each time, the humiliation hardened him a little more. School became less about education and more about survival. His temper flared often, and on 2 separate occasions he even punched school officials. Eventually, he was sent to what was known as a 600 school, a place meant for so-called incorrigible kids, the ones teachers believed couldn't be controlled. But even that system gave up on him. Just before he turned 16, the school refused to keep him any longer, and his parents signed him out. Formal education ended there. At home, his father tried desperately to redirect him. Jerry pushed discipline, routine, even religion, forcing him to attend Mass and hoping structure might tame the anger building inside his son. But the harder he pushed, the more resistant Sammy became. The streets offered something school never did: validation. On the streets, aggression wasn't a weakness. It was respected. Fearlessness wasn't punished. It was admired. And slowly, that world began to feel more like home than any classroom ever could. In 1964, as the Vietnam War era reshaped America, Gravano was drafted into the United States Army. It was a turning point that could have changed everything. He was stationed at Fort Jackson in South Carolina, far from Brooklyn's familiar sidewalks. In the Army, structure was strict, expectations were clear, and discipline wasn't optional. Interestingly, he adapted better than many expected. He worked as a mess hall cook, performing his duties without major incident. Over time, he rose to the rank of corporal, a sign that, when placed inside a rigid system, he could function, even succeed. After 2 years of service, he received an honorable discharge. On paper, it looked like a clean chapter in his life, a chance to return home with stability and perhaps choose a different path. But Brooklyn was still waiting. In 1971, he married Deborah Scabetta, stepping into what appeared to be a more traditional life. They built a family together and had 2 children. To outsiders, it may have looked like Sammy was settling down, husband, father, veteran. Years later, his daughter Karen Gravano would publicly speak about growing up as the daughter of a powerful mob figure, even appearing on the reality television series Mob Wives in 2011 and publishing a memoir about her life and her father's legacy. But at the time of that marriage, the darker side of Sammy's world was already tightening its grip. As his influence in organized crime grew, loyalty and family became dangerously intertwined. In a chilling twist that reveals how deeply he was embedded in mafia life, Gravano was later ordered to arrange the murder of his own brother-in-law, Nicholas "Little Nicky" Scabetta. In that world, blood relations did not outweigh orders. The code came first. He was also connected by marriage to Edward "Eddie" Garofalo, a soldier in the Gambino crime family, further binding him to powerful criminal networks. And his childhood friend Gerard Papa, leader of the Rampers and later associated with the Colombo crime family, remained another link tying his past to his present. By this stage, the lines between friendship, family, and organized crime had completely blurred. The bully boy who struggled to read had transformed into a man navigating one of the most ruthless criminal organizations in America. And every relationship around him, whether by blood, marriage, or childhood loyalty, was now part of a web that would eventually lead to betrayal, violence, and consequences no one could escape. By the late 1960s, Bensonhurst wasn't just a neighborhood, it was territory. For decades, the Mafia had maintained a powerful presence there through the Prophesy family, which would later evolve into the Colombo crime family. Their influence wasn't hidden, it was woven into daily life. Social clubs, construction jobs, unions, street businesses, everything had a quiet connection to La Cosa Nostra. For young men growing up in that environment, the path was almost laid out in front of them. And despite his father's efforts to keep him away from that world, Sammy Gravano found himself drifting exactly where many of his old Ramper friends were headed, straight into the arms of organized crime. In 1968, his formal connection to the mafia began through his friend Tommy Spiro. Tommy's uncle, known as Shorty Spiro, was already an associate within the Colombo family and closely aligned with a rising and ambitious figure named Carmine Persico, later known as the Snake. Through this introduction, Gravano stepped beyond street-level gang activity and into something structured, hierarchical, and far more dangerous. At first, his crimes were typical for an up-and-coming associate: larceny, hijacking trucks, armed robberies. But Sammy wasn't content staying small time. He adapted quickly, showing both nerve and business sense. Before long, he was deeply involved in racketeering schemes, loan sharking operations that trapped desperate borrowers in cycles of debt, and even managing a profitable poker game hidden in the back room of an after-hours club, a place where cash flowed freely and silence was understood. He wasn't just participating anymore. He was building. His confidence, aggression, and willingness to act without hesitation caught the attention of Carmine Persico himself. Gravano became one of Persico's trusted young enforcers, someone who could be relied upon to carry out sensitive tasks without question. At one point, he was even used as part of a public demonstration organized by Joe Colombo's Italian-American Civil Rights League. Gravano and others picketed outside the Manhattan headquarters of the FBI, a bold, almost theatrical move meant to protest what the mafia claimed was government harassment of Italian Americans. For Sammy, it wasn't about civil rights. It was about loyalty and visibility. He was being noticed. His rise was so rapid that many within the organization assumed that once the long-closed membership books of Cosa Nostra reopened, shut since 1957 to limit new members, Gravano would be one of the first to be officially made. It was no longer a question of if. It was when. Then came 1970, the year everything changed. That was when Gravano committed his first murder. The target was Joseph Colucci, a fellow associate connected to the Spiro crew. The motive was tangled in betrayal and personal conflict. Colucci had discovered that Tommy Spiro was having an affair with his wife. In the mafia's code, personal disputes could quickly become deadly, especially when pride and reputation were involved. Gravano was chosen to handle it. For him, it was both a test and a declaration, a moment that would either solidify his place in the organization or end his rise entirely. When the moment arrived, there was no dramatic speech, no cinematic music, just cold intention. Years later, Gravano would describe how the act felt surreal, almost detached. The anticipation was worse than the act itself. He recalled the rush of adrenaline, the split second where hesitation could mean death, and then the silence afterward. For many men, taking a life would leave a permanent crack in the soul. For Sammy, it did something different. It hardened him. Instead of guilt overwhelming him, he felt a disturbing clarity, a realization that he had crossed a line and survived it. In that world, murder wasn't just violence. It was proof of loyalty. And from that point on, there was no turning back. The bullied child, the struggling student, the street fighter, all of it faded into the background. What remained was a man who had proven he could kill for the organization. In La Cosa Nostra, that kind of proof didn't just earn respect. It guaranteed advancement. As a Beatles song played in the background that day, something soft and almost innocent, Sammy Gravano later said that was the exact moment his life split in two. One part of him still human, still capable of fear. The other part stepping fully into darkness. He knew Joe Colucci was going to die. And in his mind, it wasn't just business. It was survival. He believed Colucci was plotting to kill him and Shorty Spiro, and in the mafia world, waiting meant dying. Gravano would later describe the feeling as pure rage mixed with cold clarity. He said everything around him seemed to slow down, like time itself stretched thin. When he pulled the trigger, he claimed he could almost feel the bullet leave the gun and enter Colucci's skull. The moment became surreal. He didn't hear the first shot. He didn't see blood. He didn't even remember Colucci's head moving. It was as if his body was present, but his mind had drifted far away. He fired again, and afterward, he felt detached, like he was watching himself from a distance, a million miles away, trapped in a dream that didn't feel real. But it was real, and once it was done, there was no undoing it. That killing didn't isolate him, it elevated him. Carmine Persico saw what Gravano had done and approved. In the mafia, approval after a murder wasn't spoken loudly, but it carried enormous weight. Gravano had proven himself reliable under pressure. He had crossed the ultimate line and shown no hesitation. Respect followed quickly. His reputation grew stronger, and within the Colombo ranks, people began to see him as a rising force. Years later, in one of the cruelest ironies of his life, Gravano would mentor Colucci's own son, Jack, helping him find opportunities within the construction industry as a Gambino associate. For 25 years, Jack had no idea that the man guiding him had been the one who killed his father. That secret sat quietly beneath the surface, another example of how layered and ruthless that world could be. But success inside the mafia never comes without enemies. By the early 1970s, tension began building within the Colombo family itself. Ralph Spiro, a soldier and the brother of Shorty Spiro, started to resent Gravano's rapid rise. Ralph feared that Sammy would be officially made before his own son, Tommy, a humiliation in a culture obsessed with hierarchy and bloodlines. Jealousy in organized crime isn't just personal, it's dangerous. It can turn into whispers, alliances, and eventually violence. The situation grew even more volatile after the death of another Colombo soldier, Ralph Ronga, who had been part of Ralph Spiro's crew. Following Ronga's death, rumors began circulating that Gravano had tried to approach Ronga's widow, Sybil Davies, at a bar. Gravano insisted the opposite was true, that she had approached him. But in the mafia, truth rarely matters as much as perception. Ralph Spiro seized the rumor as an opportunity. Whether he believed it or not, it became a weapon, a way to stir anger and possibly justify eliminating Gravano. The tension escalated quietly behind closed doors. Talk of having Gravano killed began to surface. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was whispered in social clubs and discussed in back rooms where decisions meant life or death. Shorty Spiro stood by Gravano, believing his version of events rather than his brother Ralph's accusations. But loyalty alone couldn't erase the growing division. To prevent internal bloodshed within the Colombo family, leadership made a strategic decision. Instead of letting the rivalry explode into violence, they arranged for Gravano to be transferred to the Gambino crime family. On the surface, it looked like a routine shift, just business. But in reality, it was a survival move. The Colombo family avoided a potential war within its own ranks. And Gravano, once again, escaped death, not by accident, but by calculation. That transfer would change everything. Because while he may have left the Colombo family behind, he was stepping into something even bigger, even more powerful. And inside the Gambino family, his ambition would grow far beyond anyone's expectations. When Sammy Gravano moved into the Gambino orbit, it wasn't just a transfer, it was a promotion into one of the most powerful crime families in America. Under the Gambinos, he became an associate of Capo Salvatore Tato Orello, a respected figure with deep roots in the organization. Tato quickly saw something in Sammy, the same aggression, loyalty, and hunger that had pushed him forward before. But this time, Sammy wasn't just a street soldier. He had a mentor. Orello began guiding him, teaching him how the Gambinos operated, how power flowed quietly through construction contracts, unions, and backroom deals. For a brief moment, Gravano even took a legitimate construction job. Years later, he would claim that he considered leaving the criminal world behind. Maybe it was guilt, maybe exhaustion, or maybe it was simply curiosity about whether he could live another life. But that possibility collapsed almost instantly. A former associate approached the New York District Attorney's office and falsely accused Gravano of being involved in a double murder from 1969, the killing of the Dunn brothers. Suddenly, Sammy wasn't thinking about construction sites or second chances. He was thinking about prison. Indicted and facing serious charges, he needed money fast. Not for luxury, not for status, but to survive the legal battle ahead. That was the moment he made a choice. He quit the construction job and plunged back into crime with an intensity that even he later described as madness. For nearly a year and a half, alongside his associate Alexander "Alley Boy" Cuomo, he went on what he openly called a robbing rampage. Armed robberies, hijackings, theft, non-stop. It wasn't calculated expansion anymore. It was obsession, a desperate surge of crime fueled by fear and fury. Then, just weeks into the trial, everything shifted again. Gravano's lawyers moved to dismiss the charges after the prosecution's key witness was declared legally insane. The case collapsed. Sammy walked free. But freedom didn't calm him, it hardened him. He would later admit that arrest changed him permanently. From that point forward, he said he never slowed down. He became relentless. The brush with prison didn't scare him straight. It removed hesitation entirely. That intensity impressed Tato Orello. When the Mafia's long-closed membership books finally reopened, the first time since 1957, Orello didn't hesitate to sponsor Sammy for full membership. In 1976, Gravano was formally inducted as a made man in the Gambino family. It was a sacred ceremony, an oath sealed in blood and fire, binding him for life. Interestingly, he was initiated alongside Tato's own son, Charles "Charlie Boy" Orello, who had been Sammy's childhood friend. It wasn't just business now. It was legacy, but with power comes brutal tests. In 1978, Gambino boss Paul Castellano allegedly ordered the murder of Nicholas Scabetta, Gravano's own brother-in-law. Scabetta had spiraled into heavy cocaine use and alcohol abuse. He'd caused public disturbances and, worse in mafia terms, insulted the daughter of Gambino soldier George DeCicco. In that world, disrespect could be a death sentence. Before the hit was carried out, Frank DeCicco approached Gravano to inform him of the decision. The message was clear. Your brother-in-law is marked for death. Sammy was furious. Blood is blood. But in the Mafia, the oath comes first. After intense discussion, DeCicco managed to calm him, reminding him of the rules they had all sworn to follow. Later, Gravano admitted the truth in cold words. He chose the organization over his family. Cosa Nostra came before everything. Scabetta was murdered, dismembered, and his body was never fully recovered, except for a single severed hand. It was a chilling reminder that once you pledge loyalty to that life, there is no room for divided allegiance. Around this time, Gravano opened an after-hours club in Bensonhurst called the Bus Stop. It became a gathering place, cash flowing, music playing, men talking business in low voices. But one night, the club became the scene of chaos. A biker gang stormed in, drunk and aggressive, intent on trashing the place. A violent brawl erupted. Sammy fought, even as he suffered a broken ankle during the melee. The bikers were eventually chased out, but the insult lingered. Gravano went straight to Paul Castellano and asked for permission to retaliate. Not just to scare them, but to kill them. Castellano granted the green light. Even with his ankle in a cast, Gravano joined Laborio Louis Melito in hunting down the gang's leader. In the confrontation that followed, Gravano wounded the leader and killed another biker outright. When Castellano later learned that Sammy had personally taken part in the hit, while barely able to walk, he was stunned. It wasn't recklessness. It was commitment. By now, the bullied child from Bensonhurst was gone completely. In his place stood a made man who had chosen the Mafia over family, over fear, over second chances. And the higher he climbed inside the Gambino family, the more dangerous the game became. As the Gambino family entered a new era under Paul Castellano, the tone of the organization began to shift. Unlike old-school bosses who relied heavily on street crime, loan sharking, gambling rings, truck hijackings, Castellano preferred something quieter and far more profitable. He believed the real money wasn't on the corners of Brooklyn. It was in contracts, unions, construction projects, trucking routes, and garbage disposal companies. Clean money on paper, dirty control behind the scenes. And for someone like Sammy Gravano, who had already proven he could be ruthless, this new direction offered something even more powerful than fear. It offered wealth. Castellano had a particular fascination with the construction industry, and Gravano quickly positioned himself inside that world. Alongside his brother-in-law, Edward Garofalo, he entered the plumbing and drywall business. But this wasn't just about installing pipes or hanging sheetrock. In mafia-controlled construction, bids were manipulated, contracts were steered, and competitors were quietly pushed aside. The money flowed steadily and legally, at least on the surface. Gravano adapted perfectly. He understood intimidation, but he also understood leverage. Before long, he developed a reputation within the Gambino family as a big earner, one of the men who could consistently bring serious cash to the table. And in organized crime, earning power equals influence. As profits multiplied, Sammy's lifestyle transformed dramatically. He wasn't just a street soldier anymore. He was becoming a wealthy power player. His business ventures and rackets turned him into a multimillionaire. With that money, he built a sprawling estate for his family in rural Cream Ridge, New Jersey, far from the cramped Brooklyn streets where he grew up. The property symbolized success, legitimacy, and status. It was the kind of home that suggested he had climbed the ladder of the American dream. But the foundation of that dream was layered with secrets. His interests expanded beyond construction. Gravano invested in trotting horses that raced at the Meadowlands Racetrack in East Rutherford, New Jersey, a sport associated with wealth and prestige. Watching his horses compete gave him visibility in circles that had nothing to do with back alley meetings or smoky social clubs. It was another step into a more polished world. Back in Brooklyn, he operated a thriving discotheque called the Plaza Suite in the Gravesend section. The club wasn't just popular, it was profitable, reportedly bringing in around $4,000 a week. Gravano owned the building outright, a sign of both confidence and control. The bottom level served as his business headquarters, where deals were discussed quietly, alliances formed, and decisions made behind closed doors. Upstairs, music played and crowds danced. Downstairs, power moved silently. On the surface, Sammy Gravano appeared to have everything: money, influence, businesses, property, family. He had evolved from a bullied child with learning struggles into a multi-millionaire mob captain navigating high-level operations. But in the mafia, success also paints a target. The more visible you become, the more others begin to watch. And within the Gambino family, tensions were slowly building between those who favored Castellano's corporate style and those who longed for the street power of the old days. Sammy had mastered both worlds, violence and business. And soon, he would be forced to choose sides in a conflict that would shake the mafia to its core. Sammy Gravano's reputation didn't just grow inside New York, it began stretching beyond it. When violence erupted within the Philadelphia crime family in March 1980, the fallout reached all the way to the Commission, the ruling body of organized crime in America. Longtime Philadelphia boss Angelo Bruno had been assassinated in a shocking betrayal orchestrated by his own consigliere Antonio "Tony Bananas" Caponigro, along with Alfred Salerno. But there was one fatal mistake in their plan. They had acted without approval from the Commission. In the mafia, killing a boss without authorization wasn't ambition. It was treason. Caponigro was summoned to New York under the illusion of discussion. Instead, he was handed a death sentence. After being tortured, he was executed, a brutal message sent to anyone considering defiance. With leadership in Philadelphia reshuffled, Philip the Chicken Man, Testa became boss, and Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo stepped in as consigliere. But the commission wasn't finished. They ordered the elimination of others involved in Bruno's murder, including Johnny Keys Simone, Bruno's cousin and one of the conspirators. The contract to kill Simone was handed to Sammy Gravano. This wasn't a street hit fueled by rage. It was calculated, authorized, and deliberate. Gravano approached Simone carefully. Instead of rushing in, he arranged a series of meetings, slowly building a sense of familiarity. He earned Simone's trust, presenting himself not as an executioner, but as an ally. That patience was part of the strategy. Then, with the assistance of Laborio Louis Melito and Joseph Stymie D'Angelo, Gravano made his move. Simone was abducted from the Yardley Golf Club in Pennsylvania, a quiet, suburban setting far removed from mob violence. From there, he was driven across state lines to a wooded area on Staten Island. The journey itself must have carried a heavy silence. By then, Simone likely understood what was coming. In those final moments, Simone made two simple requests. He asked to die with his shoes off, a promise he had made to his wife, and he asked to be killed by a made man, someone who had taken the same oath he once had. Gravano granted both. He removed Simone's shoes, honoring the request. Then Melito stepped forward and shot Simone in the back of the head. Years later, Gravano would reflect on that night, not with remorse, but with a strange sense of respect. He described Simone as a man's man, someone who faced death calmly, without begging, without hysteria. In Gravano's eyes, that composure earned admiration. It was a chilling glimpse into the moral code of that world, where dignity in death mattered more than innocence in life. By carrying out the commission's order with precision and without hesitation, Gravano further strengthened his standing. He wasn't just a capable earner anymore. He was a trusted executioner for the highest authority in organized crime. And with every sanctioned killing, his value inside the Gambino family continued to rise, along with the weight of the blood he carried. After Castellano's assassination, the Gambino family was left in chaos, and the question of succession became urgent. Sammy Gravano initially had someone else in mind, Frank DeCicco. In Gravano's eyes, DeCicco had the experience, loyalty, and temperament to take over. But DeCicco saw something different. He recognized John Gotti's audacious personality, his charisma, intelligence, and sheer boldness, and believed that Gotti was better suited to lead the family than anyone else, even if it meant others would have to defer to him. DeCicco convinced Gravano to give Gotti a chance, though the decision came with a secret understanding. If Gotti failed to meet their expectations within a year, they would remove him. Gravano and DeCicco made a pact, a hidden agreement that, should Gotti's leadership falter, they would act together to eliminate him, allowing Gravano to step in as underboss while DeCicco assumed full control. The plan was meticulous from the start. The first step was to gauge support within the Gambino family itself. Many members had grown disillusioned under Castellano, frustrated by his distant, corporate-style leadership. Gravano and DeCicco quietly approached these dissatisfied soldiers and capos to win their backing for the potential hit. To strengthen the conspiracy, they recruited Joseph Piney Armone, a longtime capo with credibility and influence. Armone's support was critical, a respected elder whose voice could persuade hesitant members to shift loyalty, helping legitimize the plan and ensure internal consensus. But a hit on a boss wasn't something that could happen in isolation. In the mafia, there was a rigid, unspoken law. Killing a boss without the approval of the commission was forbidden, a violation that could spark a war across families. The conspirators knew this wasn't just risky, it was potentially suicidal. Their solution was subtle. Instead of approaching the commission directly, they courted the support of powerful mobsters in the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families. These figures acted as intermediaries, their unofficial backing providing Gravano and DeCicco with the legitimacy they needed to proceed without alerting Castellano's allies. Gotti and his allies carefully obtained the nod from key figures within the Colombos and Bonannos, while DeCicco secured support from influential Lucchese line members. They avoided involving the Genovese family entirely. Castellano's close ties to Genovese boss Vincent Chin Gigante made any approach risky. Even consulting a Genovese figure could serve as an early warning to Castellano. With the backing of off-the-record contacts from 3 out of the 5 major families, the conspirators effectively neutralized much of the political risk. Everything was poised, but the final trigger came in early December 1985. Paul Castellano's decision not to attend the wake of his longtime mentor and consigliere, Aniello Della Croce. ignited Gotti's fury. The slight wasn't just personal. In the mafia world, respect and appearances were paramount. Castellano's absence removed any remaining restraint on action. Within days, Gotti struck, setting in motion the events that would reshape the Gambino family forever. Gravano, now deeply entangled in both loyalty and ambition, was not a bystander in this new chapter. He was a pivotal force, a man whose calculated patience, past violence, and strategic mind ensured he would play a central role in the unfolding power struggle. The day of the hit had been carefully orchestrated, each detail planned with precision, yet the tension in the air was nearly tangible. Paul Castellano, unaware of the conspiracy brewing around him, had extended an invitation to his longtime consigliere, Frank DeCicco, for a meeting with several of his trusted capos. Thomas Gambino, James Jimmy Brown Fila, Johnny Gamarana, and Daniel Danny Marino. The chosen location was Spark Steakhouse in Manhattan, a spot that seemed innocuous to the casual observer but had been selected deliberately by the conspirators. The restaurant sat in a bustling area filled with holiday shoppers and pedestrians, and this crowded environment provided the perfect cover for the assassins. It was the kind of place where a few figures in plain sight could vanish into the throng without raising suspicion, making escape far easier. In the world of organized crime, the smallest details could mean the difference between success and failure, and Spark Steakhouse had checked every box. The day before the hit, December 15th, the conspirators gathered to finalize every aspect of the operation. Routes, timing, personnel, and contingencies were discussed at length. The following afternoon, they met one final time on the Lower East Side, ensuring that every member of the hit team was clear on their role. It was here that John Gotti suggested a small but brilliant tactical touch. The shooters would wear long white trench coats and black Russian fur hats. These garments were not just for disguise. They would allow the assassins to blend in with the winter crowds, appearing as ordinary pedestrians to anyone watching. Gravano later described the idea as brilliant, a simple addition that amplified their chances of success and escape. On the afternoon of December 16th, Gotti and Gravano arrived at Spark Steakhouse shortly before 5 p.m., moving cautiously and deliberately. They circled the block once, scanning the entrances and surrounding streets to ensure there were no unexpected observers. Finally, they parked across the intersection, keeping the restaurant in full view. Every second was calculated, every movement deliberate. By 5:30 p.m., Gravano spotted Castellano's Lincoln Town car approaching a nearby intersection. He immediately alerted the team of shooters stationed outside via walkie-talkie, signaling that the target was in place. Thomas Bellotti, Castellano's loyal driver and bodyguard, pulled the car up directly in front of the restaurant entrance. As Castellano and Bellotti stepped out of the Lincoln, the ambush was executed with ruthless efficiency. The shooters, clad in their trench coats and fur hats, moved with precision. A sudden barrage of bullets tore through the air. The chaos lasted only moments, but it was enough to ensure both men were dead before anyone could react. Pedestrians screamed and scattered, but the assassins melted into the crowd, disappearing into the busy Manhattan streets as if they had never been there. After the violence, Gotti remained calm, almost eerily so. He drove the car slowly past the front of Spark Steakhouse, allowing himself and Gravano a clear view of the aftermath. From the passenger window, Gravano looked down at the lifeless body of Thomas Bellotti, his expression a mixture of acceptance and cold detachment. "He's gone," he remarked, his voice steady, almost casual, but carrying the weight of the moment. In that instant, the Gambino family had been irrevocably changed. The meticulously planned hit had succeeded, power had shifted, and Gravano, once a loyal enforcer, was now a central figure in the new era of the family. A man who had witnessed the violent removal of a boss and survived to navigate the treacherous currents that followed. The assassination of Castellano marked not just a turning point for the Gambino family, but also a moment where Gravano's own life and ambitions were thrust into the spotlight. Every calculated step, every decision and every observation during that day reflected a lifetime of experience in organized crime. A mix of strategic thinking, ruthless execution, and the ability to remain calm in the most extreme circumstances. From the crowded streets outside Spark Steakhouse to the silent acceptance of what lay on the pavement, the scene became one of the most infamous and defining moments in mafia history. Following the murder of Paul Castellano, the Gambino family found itself in a precarious situation. Joseph N. Gallo, the family's only remaining senior leader from the previous administration, stepped in to maintain order by forming a temporary leadership trio alongside John Gotti and Frank DeCicco. Despite this arrangement, it was widely understood among the family's captains that Gotti was the de facto head, effectively controlling operations behind the scenes. Nearly every capo was aware of his role in orchestrating Castellano's assassination. By mid-January 1986, at a gathering of 20 senior members, Gotti was officially recognized as the new head of the organization. To solidify his power structure, he appointed DeCicco as underboss and promoted Gravano to capo, following Tato Orello's voluntary withdrawal, ensuring a loyal and capable inner circle. The precariousness of leadership became brutally evident just a few months later. On April 13, 1986, DeCicco was killed in a car bombing after stopping to see Castellano loyalist James Fila. The attack was executed by Lucchese family enforcers Victor Vic Amuso and Anthony Gaspite Casso, acting under orders from Lucchese boss Anthony, Tony Dux Corallo, and Vincent Gigani. Their mission was vengeance, targeting those who had taken Castellano and Bellatti's places. Gotti had planned to meet Fila that day as well, but canceled, narrowly avoiding the explosion himself. The device detonated at a calculated moment. When a Lucchese operative, Frankie Hartz Bellino, requested a lawyer's card from DeCicco, he went to retrieve it and sat in the passenger seat of his car, triggering the deadly blast that instantly claimed his life. The use of explosives in mafia affairs was rare and highly frowned upon, primarily because of the danger to innocent bystanders. The shocking nature of this bombing led many within the Gambino family to initially suspect Zips, Sicilian mobsters operating in America, who had a reputation for employing bombs in their operations. Even among hardened criminals accustomed to violence, the attack marked a disturbing escalation, highlighting how ruthless and unpredictable the struggle for control had become. After Castellano's assassination, the first person Gravano put on his hit list was Nicholas Mormondo, a former member of his crew whose behavior had become increasingly dangerous. Mormondo had developed a serious crack cocaine addiction, and Gravano believed he was responsible for getting his friend and fellow crew member Michael Debat hooked on the drug as well. Viewing Nicky's recklessness as a threat to the crew, Gravano decided it was necessary to eliminate him, but only after obtaining Gotti's approval to carry out the execution. Gravano set the plan in motion at his Bensonhurst restaurant, Tolly's. He arranged for Mormondo to meet him there under the guise of safety and normal business. To make the murder seem casual, Gravano instructed Mormondo to pick up Joseph Old Man Peruta along the way. Once inside the car, Peruta, seated in the back, shot Mormondo twice in the back of the head, leaving no chance for survival. The body was then dumped in a nearby vacant lot, and it was discovered the following day. The hit sent a clear message to the rest of the crew about the consequences of reckless behavior and defiance. Meanwhile, Gotti was facing his own challenges. In May 1986, he was sent to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, awaiting trial on RICO charges. With Gotti behind bars, Gravano, alongside Angelo Ruggiero and Joseph Armone, took over the day-to-day management of the family's operations, carrying out the boss's directives while Gotti continued to call the major decisions from his jail cell. The following month, Gravano was confronted with another life-or-death assignment. Ruggiero, supposedly acting on Gotti's instructions, informed him that Capo Robert DiBernardo had made critical comments about Gotti's leadership and needed to be eliminated. Gravano, who had a cordial relationship with DiBernardo, hesitated and attempted to postpone the hit until he could speak directly with Gotti after his trial. When he met with Armone, He was told again that Gotti wanted DiBernardo dead. Ruggiero later claimed that he had confirmed with Gotti personally that the order was urgent, leaving Gravano with no choice but to carry out the dangerous command. Gravano arranged a meeting with Robert DiBernardo under the pretense of business, but it was a setup. Joseph Peruta, a trusted member of Gravano's crew, sat in the back of the car and fired 2 shots into DiBernardo's head while Gravano observed. In the aftermath, Gravano realized that Angelo Ruggiero, who had initially pushed for the hit, was $250,000 in debt to DiBernardo. It became clear that Ruggiero may have fabricated Gotti's orders or twisted the story of what DiBernardo supposedly said to erase his own debt and improve his standing within the family. Regardless of the deception, DiBernardo's elimination worked to Gravano's advantage. He inherited control over Teamsters Local 282, increasing both his influence and financial power within the organization. Meanwhile, Gotti's legal troubles continued. His racketeering trial ended in a hung jury, resulting in a mistrial and his release from jail. During 1986 and 1987, Gravano's role in the family remained highly active and influential. With Gotti's approval, he orchestrated multiple hits alongside other Gambino associates, ensuring the family's operations ran smoothly even amidst legal scrutiny. Jury selection for Gotti's retrial began in August 1986, with the boss facing trial alongside Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, Leonard Lenny DeMaria, Anthony Tony Roach, Rampino, Nicholas Little Nick Carazzo, and John Carneglia. Despite Johnson being exposed as an informant, he refused to testify for the prosecution, complicating the case further. The Gambino family managed to manipulate the proceedings through George Pape, who concealed his friendship with Bosco Radonjic and was impaneled as juror number 11. Using this connection, Pape secretly communicated with Gravano and agreed to sell his vote for $60,000. On March 13, 1987, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty for Gotti and all co-defendants, delivering a stunning blow to federal prosecutors. Following the trial, Gotti's reputation soared, as the media dubbed him the Teflon Don, highlighting his uncanny ability to evade conviction despite repeated criminal charges. This victory cemented his image as one of the most cunning and untouchable figures in organized crime. With the sudden death of Frank DeCicco, the Gambino family found itself without an underboss, leaving a critical gap in its leadership. John Gotti quickly moved to fill the position, appointing Joseph Armone to take over the responsibilities and stabilize the chain of command. This decision ensured that the day-to-day operations and enforcement of the family's authority remained firmly in trusted hands. By 1987, Gravano's influence within the family had grown significantly, and he replaced Joseph N. Gallo as consigliere. Just a few years later, in 1990, Gravano's rise continued when he was promoted to underboss, taking over from acting underboss Frankie Locke Lacasio. At the same time, Gravano had cemented his position outside the criminal world as well, earning a reputation as a formidable player in the construction industry. His Bensonhurst restaurant, Tolly's, became a hub where he frequently entertained executives from major construction firms and union officials, blending legitimate business with his mafia influence in a seamless, powerful network. However, this success came with its own set of risks. Gravano's rapid ascent within the Gambino hierarchy drew the attention of federal authorities, and the FBI soon placed him under intense surveillance. On top of that, he began to notice subtle signs of envy from Gotti, who seemed increasingly aware of how lucrative Gravano's legitimate business ventures had become. Despite any tension, Gravano reported that he was generating over $2 million annually for Gotti through his union connections alone, further solidifying his value to the family. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti instituted weekly meetings at the Rave Night Social Club for all his capos, a move Gravano opposed, believing it could unnecessarily expose their operations. But ultimately, the underboss had to follow the boss's orders. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Gambino leadership had become a prime target for law enforcement. FBI agents had planted listening devices throughout the Rave Night Social Club, hidden in the main room, the first-floor hallway, and even the upstairs apartment. These bugs captured countless conversations between Gotti, Gravano, and Locascio, including discussions that directly implicated them in murders, racketeering, and other criminal activities. On December 11th, 1990, federal agents, alongside the NYPD, executed a coordinated raid on the Rave Night, arresting the three top figures of the family. Gravano eventually pleaded guilty to a superseding racketeering charge, while Gotti faced multiple serious charges. 5 murders, including Castellano, Bellotti, DiBernardo, Liborio Melito, and Luis Di Bono. Conspiracy to kill De Cavalcante, Capo Gaetano, Corky Vastola, along with loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, bribery, and tax evasion. The recordings from the FBI bugs had immediate consequences in court. The Gambino leaders were denied bail, and their attorneys, Bruce Cutler and Gerald Shargel, were disqualified from representing them after prosecutors argued the lawyers had been too closely involved with the family's inner workings, claiming the defense attorneys had functioned as de facto in-house counsel. The prosecution maintained they were potential witnesses and could no longer defend their clients. Gotti subsequently hired Albert Krieger, a Miami-based lawyer with ties to Joseph Bonanno, to take over the defense. The tapes also created deep tension between Gotti and Gravano. Among the recordings, Gotti was heard criticizing Gravano as being overly greedy and even hinting at a plan to frame him as the main perpetrator of the murders of DiBernardo, Melito, and Di Bono. Efforts to mend the rift failed, leaving Gravano increasingly disillusioned with the mob life. Faced with the possibility of going to trial without Shargel and under the looming threat of betrayal by his own boss, Gravano made a monumental decision. On November 13th, 1991, he formally agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, becoming the first high-ranking member of a New York crime family to turn informant. In the annals of the American Mafia, Gravano was only the second underboss ever to confess and testify against his own organization, following the Philadelphia crime family's Philip "Crazy Phil" Leonetti. John Gotti and Frank Locascio faced trial in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York, presided over by Judge I. Leo Glasser. Jury selection began in January 1992, and for the first time in a Brooklyn federal case, the jury was kept fully sequestered throughout the trial due to Gotti's notorious reputation for attempting to influence jurors. The trial officially opened on February 12th, when prosecutors Andrew Maloney and John Gleason presented their case. They began by playing recordings of Gotti discussing Gambino family operations, including his authorization of murders, and highlighting the intense conflict between Gotti and Castellano to establish a clear motive for the boss's assassination. The prosecution called an eyewitness to testify about the Sparks Steakhouse hit, who identified John Carneglia as one of the gunmen who had killed Thomas Bellotti. The case reached a pivotal moment on March 2nd, when Gravano took the stand. His testimony provided a comprehensive account of Gotti's position within the Gambino hierarchy and offered a chilling, step-by-step narrative of the plot to murder Castellano. Gravano recounted the hit's execution and its aftermath in precise detail. In his confession, he admitted responsibility for 19 murders and directly implicated Gotti in 4 of them, painting a damning picture of the inner workings of the organization. Despite aggressive cross-examination by Albert Krieger and Anthony Cardinale, Locascio's attorney, Gravano remained steadfast, leaving the defense unable to undermine his credibility. Over the course of the trial, additional recordings and witness testimony reinforced the prosecution's case. On March 24th, after weeks of intense courtroom drama, the government rested. During proceedings, Gotti reacted vehemently to Gravano's testimony, at one point labeling him a junkie, while the defense attempted to discredit Gravano by highlighting his history of steroid use. The trial marked a turning point in the fight against organized crime, exposing the inner workings of the Gambino family in unprecedented detail. On June 23, 1992, Judge I. Leo Glasser handed down a landmark sentence. John Gotti and Frank Locascio were both condemned to spend the rest of their lives behind bars, with no possibility of parole, and fined $250,000 each. Gotti eventually reported to federal authorities on December 14, 1992, officially ending his reign as head of the Gambino crime family. Meanwhile, on September 26, 1994, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano faced his own sentencing. Though originally looking at a potential 20-year term, the court granted him a dramatically lighter sentence of 5 years, effectively less than 1 year since he had already served 4. The government had urged the judge to be lenient, highlighting the staggering impact of Gravano's cooperation. His testimony had led to 37 convictions, 9 trials pending, and the resignation of 8 union officials, while inspiring many others to come forward against organized crime. Gravano's disclosures reshaped the underworld. In total, he implicated 29 members of the Gambino family alone, spanning the top hierarchy, captains, soldiers, and associates. This included former boss John Gotti, former consigliere Frank Locascio, and captains Robert "Bobby" Cabert Bisaccia, Thomas Gambino, Pasquale Cani, Joseph "Joe" Butch Corral, James Fila, Daniel Marino, John Gambino, and Ralph Mosca. Soldiers and affiliates named included Paul Graziano, Anthony Vinciello, Domenico Cefalu, Francesco Versaglio, Orazio Stantini, Louis Astuto, Dominic Borghese, Joseph Gambino, Peter Mosca, Virgil Alessi, Lorenzo Menino, Joseph Passanante, George Helbig, Peter Mavis, and Barry Nichilo. But Gravano didn't stop with the Gambinos. His testimony extended across families and even into New Jersey, targeting key figures such as Colombo family acting boss Victor Vic Orena and consigliere Benedetto Benny Eloy, Genovese family underboss Venero Benny Eggs Mangano, and De Cavalcante family boss Giovanni John Riggi. By turning informer, Gravano didn't just topple individuals. He struck at the very structure of organized crime, sending shockwaves through the mafia's power network. After being released early in 1994, Gravano entered the U.S. Federal Witness Protection Program. The government moved him between various safe locations, but the rigid restrictions didn't sit well with him. By 1995, after just 8 months, Gravano left the program and relocated to Phoenix, Arizona. There, he adopted the alias Jimmy Moran and launched a swimming pool installation business, trying to start a new life away from the mafia's shadow. Even outside the program, Gravano remained in the public eye. He gave interviews to magazines and appeared on national television, including a notable sit-down with journalist Diane Sawyer. Reports also suggested he had undergone plastic surgery to alter his appearance. Around this time, his marriage ended, with his wife Deborah divorcing him in 1991. In 1997, Gravano collaborated with author Peter Moss on the biography Underboss, recounting his life in the mafia and his decision to become a government witness. Gravano explained that he turned informant after realizing that the mafia's code of honor was a sham, particularly following Gotti's attempts to frame him during their trial. Despite previously criticizing Gotti's hunger for publicity, Gravano hired a publicist to help with the book's promotion. The release of Underboss triggered backlash. Families of Gravano's past victims filed a $25 million lawsuit against him, though it ultimately failed. That same year, New York State charged him on an old RICO case and seized the profits he had earned from the book. While living in Arizona, Gravano maintained unusual relationships with federal agents, who he later described as personal friends visiting him during vacations. Yet, his openness angered his former mob associates. An interview with the Arizona Republic, which he initially wanted to block, revealed that his family lived with him, provoking outrage from the Gambino family. The FBI later reported that Peter Gotti ordered 2 Gambino soldiers, Thomas Carbonaro and Eddie Garofalo, to kill Gravano in Arizona in 1999. Despite his past, Gravano returned to criminal activity by the late 1990s. His son Gerard became connected to Michael Papa, a leader of the Devil Dogs gang, while Gravano built a large ecstasy trafficking operation. The enterprise reportedly sold over 30,000 pills a week, bringing in approximately $500,000 weekly. In February 2000, federal authorities cracked down on the operation. Gravano, his ex-wife Deborah, his daughter Karen, Gerard, and nearly 40 others were arrested on state and federal drug charges. Informants and recorded conversations implicated Gravano, including discussions with Deborah and Karen about drug profits. On May 25, 2001, he pleaded guilty in federal court in New York, and on June 29th, he pleaded guilty to state charges in Arizona. In 2002, Gravano was diagnosed with Graves' disease, a thyroid disorder that can cause fatigue, weight loss despite increased appetite, and hair loss. That same year, he received consecutive sentences. In September, he was sentenced in New York to 20 years, and in October, Arizona added 19 years to run concurrently. He was also placed under lifetime supervised release and fined $100,000. He served his time at ADX Florence in Colorado, including periods in solitary confinement. Gerard received 9 years in prison, while Deborah and Karen were sentenced to probation. In 2003, Sammy and Karen were also ordered to pay over $805,000 to cover court and investigative expenses from an earlier drug case. Further legal troubles arose when New Jersey prosecutors indicted Gravano in 2003 for allegedly ordering the 1980 killing of NYPD Detective Peter Calabro by Richard the Iceman Kuklinski. Gravano denied involvement and rejected a plea deal that would have avoided additional prison time. The charges were ultimately dropped after Kuklinski's death in 2006. In 2015, Gravano's request for early release was denied due to his long-standing history of extreme violence. He spent time in the Arizona State Prison System at a Special Services Unit. While initially scheduled for release in March 2019, he was ultimately freed earlier on September 18, 2017. Case 2 Shirley and Soucy entered the world in 1945, born to Teresa Soucy on the Hobbema Reserve, part of the Samson Cree Nation, lying quietly south of Edmonton in Alberta. Those who knew her spoke of a bright, lively spirit, someone curious about the world, full of energy and unafraid to follow her own path. Shirley had a joyfulness that could lift those around her, and a natural freedom in the way she carried herself. Yet, beneath her vibrant personality, life had already begun to shape her in ways that were both beautiful and deeply challenging, laying the foundation for the struggles that would later define her story. During her teenage years, Shirley was sent to her Minneskin residential school, a place that promised education but became a landscape of hardship and suffering. It was here that she formed a close connection with a fellow student named Flora Northwest. Their friendship was a rare source of support and comfort in a harsh environment. But both girls endured abuse during their time at the school, leaving scars that neither would fully escape. When they returned to their home on the reserve at 16, Shirley carried with her the invisible weight of those experiences, which would quietly influence her decisions and the course of her life as she stepped into adulthood. In her early 20s, Shirley chose to leave the reserve, seeking opportunities and independence in the city of Edmonton. She found work in catering, moving through a world that was at once unfamiliar and full of possibility. Eventually, she relocated to Vancouver, taking on work as a domestic helper, trying to create a life that balanced survival and hope. Despite the distance from home, Shirley stayed connected to her mother, sending money when she could and thoughtful cards on birthdays and holidays, gestures that reflected her enduring care and love, even as she navigated the complexities of adult life far from her childhood home. Shirley's personal life was marked by both love and heartbreak. She became the mother of 2 boys, but her joy in motherhood was shattered when they were taken from her by the child welfare system. The circumstances were painful and complicated, potentially fueled by unverified accusations from the boy's father, with whom Shirley had a troubled relationship. Those who knew her described the removal of her children as devastating, a rupture that left Shirley emotionally adrift and deeply wounded, her role as a mother ripped from her hands in a way that few could understand. Following the loss of her sons, Shirley struggled to cope with the pain. She turned to alcohol and drugs as a way to numb the grief and the mounting pressures of her life. The tragedy compounded when her infant daughter was also removed from her care, leaving Shirley to confront yet another profound loss. By the mid-1970s, her reliance on substances had become severe, a coping mechanism for the unrelenting hardships she faced. Yet, even in the midst of these challenges, those around her observed a woman who still sought stability, maintaining her home and taking care of her appearance, determined to hold on to fragments of control and dignity in a life that often seemed determined to strip them away. Shirley Nsuse was last seen in 1977, back on her home reserve, attending the funeral of her eldest brother. For those who knew her, this would be the last time they saw her in person, a fleeting moment that would later haunt family memories. At the funeral, her niece, Violet Nsuse-Wolfe, recalled asking Shirley if she planned to return home for good. Shirley's reply was calm, yet distant. She intended to go back to Vancouver and perhaps visit a friend in Seattle. There was nothing in her words to suggest the ominous uncertainty that would follow, only the quiet intention of a woman moving through her own path, unaware that this would mark the last known trace of her presence for years to come. By 1979, the silence from Shirley grew heavier. The letters and correspondence that had once arrived faithfully in Hobbema stopped altogether, leaving a void that unsettled her family. Her mother, Teresa Nsuse, was particularly devastated, often lamenting nightly over the disappearance of her daughter, unable to find peace in the absence of answers. Violet Nsuse-Wolfe, deeply affected by her aunt's vanishing, felt the weight of a promise pressing on her young shoulders. She vowed to search for Shirley and, somehow, bring her home, no matter how impossible it seemed. The determination of a niece to honor her mother's grief would soon define decades of relentless pursuit. In 1980, at just 20 years old, Violet began a series of grueling journeys in search of Shirley. She drove 13 hours at a time from her home to British Columbia and Seattle, exploring every possible place where her aunt might be: morgues, hostels, hospitals, and cemeteries. Each stop was painstaking, emotionally exhausting, and often filled with dead ends. There were no leads in California, as Shirley had never given her family reason to think she might be there. And yet every day Violet continued, fueled by a mixture of hope, love, and a promise she could not break. Each search carried the weight of years of unanswered questions, the quiet desperation of a family haunted by disappearance, and the relentless drive of someone determined to uncover even the smallest clue. Over the years, Violet's search yielded some fragments of Shirley's life. In 2006, through the power of DNA technology and Ancestry.com, she was able to locate both of Shirley's sons. One of them eventually returned to live on the reserve, a bittersweet reconnection that brought a measure of closure and joy amidst decades of uncertainty. Yet the broader mystery of Shirley's disappearance remained unsolved, a shadow that lingered over the family. Violet never ceased her efforts. She continued traveling, investigating, asking questions, and piecing together the story of her aunt, often aided by Shirley's remaining loved ones. Flora Northwest and Shirley's sister Belle were both instrumental in these efforts, providing insight, memories, and guidance until Belle's death in 2011. Even decades later, the weight of the search remained with Violet. In 2019, she spoke publicly at a women's conference, recounting the years of tireless searching she undertook to fulfill her promise to her mother, who had passed away in 1991. Her story was one of love, dedication, and the painful reality of letting go when the answers you seek may never fully arrive. Yet despite the grief and frustration, her persistence kept Shirley's memory alive, turning absence into action and loss into a lifelong mission to honor the woman who had shaped so many lives, even in her disappearance. On July 14th, 1980, Shirley Nsuse's life came to a horrifying and final end, discovered in the quiet rows of an almond orchard outside Delano, California, near the stretch of Highway 99. Her body lay 13 rows deep, far from any road, hidden among the orderly lines of trees, a place that spoke to both isolation and intention. It was an irrigation worker, going about the mundane rhythm of tending the orchard, who stumbled upon the scene. An unexpected intrusion into a world that had already ended for Shirley. The scene itself told a grim story. The soil bore the marks of tire tracks, yet there were no footprints nearby, suggesting she had been transported from somewhere else, killed elsewhere, and deliberately placed there. The circumstances of her death were brutal. Shirley had been raped shortly before her death and stabbed 29 times in the chest and abdomen. Her arms bore defensive wounds, evidence of a struggle, a desperate fight for survival against overwhelming violence. She was found fully clothed in a pink blouse, yet her personal belongings, jewelry, purse, any form of identification, were missing, leaving her presence in the orchard as ghostly as it was tragic. Each detail painted a grim picture of a young woman caught in a moment of extreme violence. Her life extinguished far from the world she had once navigated with curiosity and care. The autopsy revealed even more about Shirley's identity and life. At the time of her death, she was estimated to be between 30 and 35 years old, likely standing around 64 inches tall and weighing approximately 115 pounds. She was carrying a blood alcohol content of 0.3%, and a bottle of Michelob beer had been recovered near the scene. The examination also revealed prior pregnancies and childbirth, and a surgical rod in one of her legs. Details that spoke quietly of a life lived with both love and pain, and struggles that would remain invisible to those who only knew the tragedy of her final moments. There were unique markers that would later aid in her identification. On her left arm were 2 tattoos. One simply read, "Mother, I love you," a testament to her enduring connection to family, while the other bore the words, "Love you, Shirley, Seattle," a quiet, personal declaration that echoed her life between cities, family, and relationships. Despite these identifying features, her body remained unknown for years, buried in an anonymous grave in California, a stark reminder of the many lost lives whose stories are nearly forgotten before they are even told. While her identity remained a mystery, the young woman discovered in that California orchard became officially known to investigators as Kern County Jane Doe No. 5. Despite her violent end, authorities refused to let her story fade into obscurity. Fingerprints were sent to both Washington and Nevada, under the assumption that she may have been a migrant worker following seasonal harvests. The tattoo that read Seattle offered a tantalizing clue, but it only deepened the uncertainty. Was she connected to the city, or had she simply lived there briefly? Every lead seemed tantalizing yet frustratingly incomplete, a thread that threatened to unravel but never quite formed a picture. Investigators also tried to trace the origin of her tattoos, hoping that the unique designs might lead to the person who inked them, or at least the city where she had spent time. But the search came up empty. Tattoo artists in Los Angeles reported that the style did not match local trends, and no shop could claim the work. Despite repeated efforts, tip lines, and media broadcasts by the Kern County Sheriff Coroner Division, no meaningful leads emerged. Every attempt to uncover her identity seemed to hit a wall, reinforcing the haunting thought that she was not a local, that her life had been lived elsewhere, leaving little trace for the investigators combing through California. Years later, the case took on a darker dimension. Following the arrest and sentencing of her killer, information emerged that cast light on her final hours. Investigators theorized that Shirley had been abducted from a pub called Ruby's in nearby Kings County, a bar that no longer exists and has since been replaced by an establishment now known as the Wrecking Ball. Witnesses and evidence suggested that she may have been known at the time by the name Rebecca Ochoa, or simply Becky, though verifying this was impossible. Even years later, media coverage added confusion. A crime show featuring her case referred to her as Becky Ochoa, leading her niece, Violet Sousa Wolf, to dismiss the connection, unsure if the program had accurately represented her aunt's life or if it was simply a fabricated alias. By July 2018, decades after Shirley vanished, the case found new life when Don Ratliff, who had been overseeing the investigation, reached out to the DNA Doe Project. The team, specializing in using genetic genealogy to identify unknown decedents, took on the challenge. This move marked the beginning of a modern chapter in a story that had spanned decades, a story of disappearance, violence, and the relentless pursuit of truth that refused to be silenced by time. Every clue, every lead, every DNA match would become a step closer to uncovering the identity of the woman who had remained lost for so long, whose life and death had left an indelible mark on those who sought to remember her. In 2008, decades after Shirley and Susay had vanished and her body had been discovered, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source: DNA evidence. Tests identified a 56-year-old man named Wilson Choast as a suspect in the murder of the then-unidentified woman. At the time, Choast was already serving a life sentence in a California state prison for a string of violent crimes committed in August and September of 1980, including kidnapping, robbery, and rape. He was scheduled for parole in 2017, yet the authorities were cautious. Kern County initially refrained from filing charges in Shirley's case, believing they could not pursue a prosecution without confirming the victim's identity. The uncertainty left the investigation in a state of limbo, the possibility of justice hanging in the balance while time marched on. The puzzle began to take shape again in 2012 when DNA harvested from old rape kits dating back to 1980 linked Shirley's murder to another brutal killing. This second victim, a woman found raped and stabbed in Westlake Village in Ventura County on July 18, 1980, was also unidentified. The similarity between the crimes was striking. Both women had suffered sexual assault and violent stabbing in a manner that suggested the same perpetrator. The connection prompted Ventura County investigators to absorb Shirley's case in 2013, recognizing that the pattern of violence pointed toward a dangerous repeat offender whose crimes spanned county lines and whose identity had remained hidden for decades. With Choast's DNA now tying him to two nearly identical murders, investigators finally had grounds to bring the case to court, even though neither of the victims had yet been formally identified. The legal system moved deliberately, but with urgency. In September 2015, Choast was transferred to Ventura County by court order, and within days, on September 30th, he was formally charged with 3 counts of murder. The trial in Ventura County Superior Court would test the limits of justice, relying on decades-old evidence, DNA breakthroughs, and the painstaking work of investigators who had refused to let the victims' identities, or their stories, be erased. On May 31st, 2018, the court delivered a verdict. Wilson Choast was convicted of the rape and murder of the 2 women, a conclusion that brought a measure of accountability to crimes that had remained unresolved for nearly 4 decades. The trial also included charges for the murder of the Ventura County victim's unborn son, a grim testament to the brutality of Choast's actions, though he was ultimately found not guilty on that count. Choast was sentenced to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the ability to harm another woman. The convictions marked a significant milestone in a long, painful pursuit of justice, bringing closure to the perpetrator's actions even as questions about the lives lost and the families affected lingered in the shadows. In 2018, a new chapter began in the decades-long mystery of Kern County Jane Doe when the DNA Doe Project officially took on the case. Using what remained of the evidence, investigators extracted DNA from the bloodstains on the pink blouse in which Shirley had been found, a method far less invasive and costly than exhuming her remains. However, the DNA was highly degraded after so many years, and it would take nearly an entire year for the team to fully reconstruct her genetic profile. By May 2019, the painstaking work paid off, and Shirley's genome was uploaded to GeneMatch, a genetic database that could help trace her family lines. At first, there were no matches, and the silence of the database mirrored the decades of unanswered questions surrounding her identity. Then, in September 2019, a breakthrough emerged. An individual uploaded their DNA to GeneMatch and was flagged as a half-second cousin to Shirley, meaning they shared one great-grandparent. While the connection alone did not immediately reveal which great-grandparent it was, it opened a vital thread for investigators to follow. Volunteers with the DDP meticulously traced the cousin's lineage, discovering that one of the shared great-grandparents was indigenous. This clue directed the search toward Shirley's indigenous ancestry, but progress was slow. Sparse records, limited participation in DNA databases, and a history of oral tradition rather than written documentation made reconstructing her family tree extraordinarily challenging. Despite these obstacles, the DDP team continued their work, slowly piecing together Shirley's heritage. They determined that both of Kern County Jane Doe's parents likely originated from Musqueam, while other branches of her family had roots stretching into Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Even distant connections proved critical. One woman, Trish Herderbyes of the Couchiching First Nation, was so moved by Shirley's story that she completed DDP's training program and became one of the rare Canadian volunteers dedicated to helping identify unknown individuals. Each discovery, however small, carried weight. It represented a step closer to giving Shirley Nsousay back her name, restoring her presence to the narrative that had for so long only remembered her as a tragic unknown. The painstaking tracing of her indigenous lineage, the careful analysis of degraded DNA, and the tireless dedication of volunteers across borders illustrate just how complex solving Shirley's case had become. Every obstacle, from incomplete records to the long passage of time, highlighted both the difficulties in forensic genealogy and the persistence of those unwilling to let her story remain lost. With each thread, the mystery surrounding Kern County Jane Doe slowly began to unravel, bringing hope to a decades-long search and a family that had never stopped asking the hardest question. Where had Shirley gone in February 2020? The DNA Doe Project took a bold step to bring closure to the decades-old mystery of Kern County Jane Doe. Through a Facebook post, they shared a facial reconstruction created by Carl Koppelman, alongside the painstaking research they had conducted on the woman's lineage. The post called on indigenous communities in the area to assist by uploading their DNA to GEDmatch, offering instructions on how to participate and contribute to the search. Just days later, Violet Sousa-Wolf, Shirley's niece, came across the post and immediately felt a spark of recognition. Something in the reconstruction, in the story, in the lineage details, resonated deeply with her, and she suspected that the unidentified Jane Doe could finally be her long-lost aunt, Shirley. Violet had previously uploaded her DNA to Ancestry.com in her ongoing search for Shirley's children, but law enforcement could not access that data. Acting quickly, she submitted her DNA to GEDmatch, bridging the critical gap between family and forensic investigation. Within a short time, the decades-long mystery was resolved. In February 2020, Kern County Jane Doe was officially confirmed as Shirley Nsousay. The announcement to the public came a little over a year later, on April 23, 2021, marking the end of a long chapter of uncertainty for Shirley's family and the beginning of a process to honor her memory properly. With Shirley's identity finally known, her family began the work of bringing her home. Plans were made to have her remains exhumed and transported from California back to Canada for reburial, but the COVID-19 pandemic caused delays, postponing the process until May 2022. Before the exhumation, a small memorial service was held on May 26th at the California Cemetery, where she had been interred anonymously. The service included cemetery staff, coroner's office personnel, and a traditional ceremony performed by the Tule River Tribe of California, featuring smudging, songs, and blessings to honor Shirley's life and spirit. On May 27th, 2022, Shirley's remains were flown from California to Edmonton International Airport, marking her long-awaited return to her homeland. A memorial service followed at a funeral home in Wetaskiwin, where family and community members gathered to pay their respects. From there, Shirley's journey home continued to Musqueam, where she was reburied in a ceremony steeped in tradition. Drumming, songs, and prayers filled the air as her family and community honored her life, her memory, and her return to the land she had come from. On May 28, 2022, Shirley Insusay was finally interred at Riverside Cemetery in Musqueam, resting at last among her ancestors and her people, a homecoming decades in the making. In 2022, Shirley Insusay's story reached a wider audience when her case, alongside that of Ventura County Jane Doe, was featured in an episode of Cold Case Files. The broadcast brought Shirley's life and tragic death to viewers who had never heard her story, and it sparked responses from Indigenous families across Canada and the United States. Many reached out to Violet Sousa Wolf, sharing their own experiences with missing loved ones and hoping for guidance or the possibility of closure. The ripple effect of Shirley's story reminded viewers that her life was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger narrative of families searching tirelessly for answers across generations. Shirley's story continued to inspire new projects and media attention. As of May 2022, a documentary focused on her life and disappearance was still in production, aiming to tell her story with care, depth, and accuracy. Then, in 2023, her case reached audiences again through the Hulu web series Web of Death, highlighting the decades-long search, the painstaking forensic work, and the dedication of those committed to uncovering the truth. Each retelling ensured that Shirley's life, her struggles, and her memory were no longer forgotten, offering a sense of recognition that had been absent for far too long. The case also had a profound impact on those who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Trish Hurtubise, a distant genetic match, inspired to volunteer for the DNA Doe Project because of Shirley's story, had by 2021 worked on over 150 cases, helping bring identities and closure to families of unknown decedents. Shirley's story became more than a case file. It became a catalyst for action, inspiring people to dedicate their time and skills to uncovering the truth for others. Beyond individual efforts, Shirley's case contributed to a larger conversation about systemic issues. The publicity surrounding her story has been used to shed light on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and MMIW movement, particularly in Canada, where awareness of these tragedies is critical. Her life, disappearance, and eventual identification have become a symbol of perseverance, remembrance, and the urgent need for justice, turning a long-hidden tragedy into a powerful story that continues to inspire, educate, and call attention to the realities faced by Indigenous women and their families. Case 3 Joseph Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the small Bavarian town of Günzburg, into a Catholic family that valued discipline and achievement. He was the eldest of 3 sons, with 2 younger brothers, Carl Jr. and Alois, growing up in a household that emphasized both education and ambition. His father, Carl Mengele, was a successful businessman who had founded a company producing farming machinery. By 1915, the company had expanded into manufacturing military equipment, including specialized wagons and naval mine components. Joseph's father would later join the Nazi Party and the SS, not necessarily out of ideological commitment, but to advance his own career in local politics. This environment of ambition, structure, and rising nationalism formed the backdrop to Joseph's early life, influencing both his worldview and his future pursuits. From a young age, Mengele excelled in school and showed a deep interest in music, art, and skiing, hobbies that reflected both intellectual curiosity and a disciplined approach to personal development. At just 13, in 1924, he joined the Greater German Youth League, a right-wing youth organization, and quickly rose to lead the local chapter by 1927. These formative years exposed him to nationalist ideologies, physical training, and hierarchical structures that would later align with the political climate of Germany in the 1930s. By April 1930, he completed his secondary education and set his sights on medicine, enrolling at the University of Munich, though his academic path would soon take several turns. After 2 semesters in Munich, Mengele transferred to the University of Bonn, where he completed his medical preliminary examination. During this time, in 1931, he joined der Stahlhelm, Bund der Frontsoldaten, a paramilitary organization composed largely of World War I veterans, which would later be absorbed into the Nazi Sturmabteilung, the infamous SA. His involvement in these groups provided him with both connections and exposure to the paramilitary culture that permeated German society at the time. Part of 1933 was spent studying at the University of Vienna, before he returned to Munich to earn a PhD in anthropology in 1935 under Theodor Mollison, a physical anthropologist known for promoting the pseudoscience of racial hierarchy. Mengel's doctoral dissertation, titled Racial Morphological Study of the Anterior Segment of the Mandible in Four Racial Groups, was an early indication of his preoccupation with human differences and the pseudoscientific measurement of bodies to justify racial theories. In it, he attempted to argue that the shape and size of the lower jaw could determine racial identity, a study rooted in the flawed and dangerous ideologies that would later define his role in the Nazi regime. These academic pursuits, combined with his early exposure to nationalism, paramilitary training, and a family environment that prized ambition, laid the foundation for the path that would lead him into some of history's most horrific crimes. By January 1937, Joseph Mengele had fully stepped into the world of genetics and racial studies, joining the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt. There, he worked under the supervision of Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a respected German geneticist with a particular obsession with twins. Mengele's work initially appeared clinical and scientific, focusing on hereditary factors that could produce physical anomalies like cleft lips, cleft palates, or cleft chins. Yet beneath this veneer of academic research, a darker fascination with human variation and control was taking root, an obsession that would later underpin some of the most horrific crimes of the 20th century. Mengele's efforts at the Institute earned him a cum laude doctorate in medicine from the University of Frankfurt in 1937. Verschuer himself praised Mengele's reliability and his ability to clearly present complex material, a commendation that in retrospect reveals the meticulousness and persuasive skill that would later make him a feared figure in Auschwitz. By 1938, he was officially hired as a permanent assistant, a position that also gave him authority to assess the racial heritage of individuals applying for the so-called Aryan Certificate, a document that determined whether a person could hold a government job or claim German citizenship. In this role, Mengele wielded bureaucratic power over life and identity, quietly practicing a form of social control that foreshadowed the atrocities he would soon commit on a vastly larger and more deadly scale. Even as he pursued his academic and administrative ambitions, Mengele built a personal life that masked the emerging darkness within him. On July 28, 1939, he married Irene Skonbein, a woman he had met during his residency in Leipzig. Their family expanded with the birth of their only child, a son named Rolf, in 1944. The normalcy of family life stood in stark contrast to the horrors Mengele would later inflict on others, a chilling reminder of the capacity for compartmentalization, of maintaining appearances while committing unimaginable crimes. The juxtaposition of domestic stability with growing obsession over race and genetics set the stage for the transformation of a respected scientist into one of history's most notorious murderers. By 1937, Joseph Mengele had fully aligned himself with the Nazi Party, officially joining its ranks that year, and in 1938, he became a member of the Schutzstaffel, or SS. His military training began soon after with the Gebirgsjäger, the elite mountain infantry, and by June 1940, he was called up for service in the Wehrmacht shortly after the outbreak of World War II. Ambitious and eager, Mengele volunteered for medical service within the Waffen-SS, the combat branch of the SS, where he served as an SS Untersturmführer, equivalent to a second lieutenant, in a medical reserve battalion. This period marked his first real exposure to the machinery of war and the brutal hierarchies of Nazi command, laying the foundation for his later actions where obedience to ideology would translate into deadly control over human life. Later in 1940, Mengele was assigned to the engineering battalion of the 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, first as an assistant medical officer and later as the primary medical officer from October 1941. The unit underwent intense training in Ulm before being deployed southeast of Lublin, preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. On June 30th, 1941, they crossed into Ukraine, marking the beginning of a campaign that would be brutal in both combat and civilian impact. Just days later, on July 2nd, the commander of the division's Westland Regiment was killed by a sniper, triggering a violent response by the division. Thousands of Jewish civilians were executed in what historians now classify as one of the early pogroms of the Eastern Front. While Mengele did not personally take part in the killings, historical records indicate he must have been aware of the atrocities taking place around him. The scale of violence was staggering. Estimates suggest that in the division's first week during Barbarossa, between 4,280 and 6,950 Jewish civilians were murdered. This was Mengele's introduction to the reality of state-sanctioned mass killing, a world where human life could be destroyed systematically and where ideology justified horror. Amidst this, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class on July 14, 1941, a military decoration recognizing bravery, yet a chilling reminder of how such recognition could be awarded even in a context of complicity and moral blindness. Mengele's unit continued its operations across Ukraine and into Russia, participating in Case Blue, the German offensive from June to November 1942. They were ordered towards Stalingrad in late December, a campaign defined by violence, suffering, and strategic ruthlessness. These early years of military service placed Mengele in direct proximity to large-scale human slaughter, exposing him to a culture in which obedience, efficiency, and ideology outweighed morality. This experience, combined with his background in racial pseudoscience, set the stage for the atrocities he would later carry out in the camps, where his experiments and selections would take the mechanics of killing from the battlefield to systematic genocide. By mid-1942, Joseph Mengele's military career had earned him recognition for acts of courage on the battlefield. After rescuing 2 German soldiers from a burning tank, he was decorated with the Iron Cross First Class, the Wound Badge in black, and the Medal for the Care of the German People. Yet this outward honor masked a deeper trajectory into cruelty. Later that year, he was seriously wounded near Rostov-on-Don and declared unfit for active combat. Once recovered, Mengele was transferred to the SS Race and Settlement main office in Berlin, where he received a promotion to SS Hauptsturmführer, equivalent to captain, in April 1943. For several months, he resumed work with his former mentor, Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, now at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics, deepening his obsession with genetics and racial hierarchy, a fixation that would soon be wielded as a tool of terror. Meanwhile, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, originally designed as a labor camp, had by 1942 transformed into a combined labor and extermination center. Trains arrived daily, carrying prisoners from across Nazi-controlled Europe. The SS had begun conducting selections immediately upon arrival. Men, women, and children were forced to march past doctors who determined, in mere moments, whether a prisoner was fit to work or to be killed. Those judged unfit, typically nearly 3/4 of those arriving, were sent straight to the gas chambers. This included all children, the elderly, pregnant women, and anyone who appeared weak, ill, or less than perfectly healthy. In this environment, Mengele's fascination with racial science would find its most horrific application, giving him both authority and terrifying freedom. Encouraged by Verschuer to join the concentration camp service, Mengele applied and was assigned to Auschwitz in May 1943. He was appointed by SS Standortarzt Eduard Wirths as the chief physician of the Romani family camp within Auschwitz II-Birkenau. His title belied the reality of his duties. Mengele and other SS doctors did not provide care or treatment to prisoners. Instead, they oversaw forced inmate doctors and controlled every aspect of life, health, and death within the camp. Each week, he visited the hospital barracks, and any prisoner who had not recovered after a mere 2 weeks in bed was sent directly to the gas chambers. This routine, coldly bureaucratic and disguised as medical authority, allowed Mengele to exercise lethal control over thousands of lives with chilling efficiency. At Auschwitz, Mengele's presence brought an unparalleled terror to the camp. His decisions, cloaked in the guise of medical and scientific authority, determined who would live and who would die, often within moments of their arrival. Behind the walls of the camp, victims had no chance to plead, no opportunity to resist. Their fates were sealed by a man who wielded his education, ambition, and warped obsession with race as instruments of murder. It was here that the darkest chapters of his life would unfold, as he transformed from a disciplined scientist and soldier into one of history's most notorious perpetrators of human suffering. At Auschwitz, Joseph Mengel's role quickly became synonymous with terror. Among his many duties, he carried out selections of newly arrived prisoners, the cruel process by which men, women, and children were sorted in moments between life and death. Those deemed fit to work were admitted into the camp, while those judged unfit were sent immediately to the gas chambers. Unlike many SS doctors who considered selections distasteful or stressful, Mengel approached the task with a disturbing flamboyance, smiling, whistling, and moving among the terrified crowds as if performing a casual inspection. His true obsession, however, lay elsewhere. He constantly scanned the arriving prisoners, seeking sets of twins for his twisted experiments, or searching for physicians, pharmacists, and medical professionals who could be coerced into assisting his research. His clinical detachment, combined with a perverse curiosity, allowed him to wield life-or-death power over thousands, blending the veneer of science with acts of pure murder. Mengel's involvement extended far beyond mere selection. He was one of the SS doctors responsible for supervising the administration of Zyklon B, the cyanide-based pesticide used in Birkenau's gas chambers. He oversaw mass killings in crematoria 4 and V, ensuring that the machinery of extermination ran efficiently. In the women's camp, when a typhus epidemic erupted, Mengel orchestrated a horrifying solution. He cleared an entire block of 600 women, sending them to the gas chambers, then disinfected and prepared the barracks for survivors from neighboring blocks. This process of systematic murder and sanitation was repeated during subsequent outbreaks of scarlet fever, measles, and other diseases. For Mengel, the deaths of these prisoners were merely an administrative step in his pursuit of order, cleanliness, and scientific opportunity. In recognition of his efficiency and ruthless service, Mengel was awarded the War Merit Cross, second class with swords. By 1944, he had been promoted to first physician of the Birkenau subcamp, a title that gave him unprecedented authority over life and death. With this position, he could select victims at will, choose subjects for his experiments, and maintain control over the medical and extermination processes at Auschwitz. Every action he took was methodical, calculated, and chillingly devoid of empathy, reflecting a mind that had merged scientific curiosity with monstrous cruelty. Mengel's reign of terror at Auschwitz was marked not only by his obsession with twins and racial studies, but also by his complete embrace of the Nazi machinery of death. Each selection, each experiment, and each calculated extermination reinforced the horrific system that allowed him to transform human suffering into data points for his pseudoscientific ambitions. Survivors would later recount the casual, almost theatrical demeanor with which he carried out selections, an eerie contrast to the suffering and terror of his victims. And it is this terrifying duality that cements his place as one of history's most infamous perpetrators of mass murder. At Auschwitz, Joseph Mengel transformed the Romani family camp into a personal laboratory for his obsession with heredity and human variation. Under the guise of anthropological research, he conducted cruel medical experiments on inmates, targeting those he found physically unusual. His particular focus fell on identical twins, people with heterochromia iridoum, eyes of two different colors, dwarfs, and individuals with congenital abnormalities. These prisoners were stripped of their dignity and autonomy, reduced to specimens in a grotesque exercise of science. Mengel meticulously documented their bodies, conducted measurements, and collected biological samples, forwarding organs and tissues to the SS Medical Academy in Graz. Supported by a grant from the German Research Foundation, he had the resources to establish a pathology laboratory attached directly to Crematorium 2, where forced collaborators like Miklos Niisli, a Jewish pathologist, prepared specimens and performed autopsies under Mengel's direction. What should have been a place of care and healing became instead a chamber of systematic torture and death. One of Mengel's experiments during this period involved an outbreak of Noma, a gangrenous bacterial disease of the mouth and face, in the Romani camp in 1943. He used this epidemic as an opportunity to observe, test, and control, enlisting the coerced assistance of Berthold Epstein, a Jewish pediatrician and professor. Children suffering from the disease were isolated in barracks, subjected to treatments that were alternately administered and withheld. While initial administration of vitamins and antibiotics brought measurable improvement, Mengel abruptly stopped treatment once his observations met his scientific curiosity. The children relapsed, their health collapsing as he preserved their organs and heads for shipment to research facilities. In his eyes, their suffering was data, their illness a subject to be studied rather than lives to be saved. These experiments were not random acts of cruelty. They were methodical, calculated, and meticulously documented. Mengel's fascination with twins, congenital abnormalities, and genetic anomalies dictated every decision he made. Survivors would later recall the eerie precision with which he measured, prodded, and experimented, all while maintaining an air of casual authority. He treated human beings not as people, but as living specimens, objects to satisfy his obsession with heredity and racial purity. By the time the Romani camp was liquidated in 1944, Mengel had overseen not only the murder of its remaining occupants, but also the preservation of countless remains for his ongoing pseudoscientific research, a chilling testament to his calculated cruelty and the cold efficiency of his atrocities. In the horrific environment of Auschwitz, Mengel turned his obsession with human genetics into a devastating reality. Working under the influence of his mentor, Ottmar Verschuer, he collected blood samples from hundreds of prisoners of varying racial backgrounds, claiming that each group carried unique proteins that could be analyzed in a laboratory. The idea was framed as scientific research, but in reality, it was a grotesque pretense that justified the suffering of countless victims. Most of the records of these studies were lost or destroyed, leaving only the fragments of evidence and the harrowing testimonies of those who witnessed his cruelty firsthand. Twins became the central focus of Mengel's experiments, and children as young as 2 were subjected to his twisted methods. He treated one twin as a test subject while the other acted as a control, a warped application of experimental science. For him, Auschwitz provided a grimly convenient collection of subjects, something rarely found outside such a brutal setting. Historian estimates suggest he experimented on possibly 1,000 sets of twins, many of whom endured repeated physical measurements, invasive examinations, and forced documentation of every anatomical feature. Some siblings even pretended to be twins, desperately hoping to survive, though this ruse often failed to save them. Weekly assessments became a relentless routine, eroding both the children's physical health and their sense of safety. The true purpose of Mengel's twin experiments remains unclear, leaving only speculation and horror behind. Some evidence suggests he aimed to uncover ways to increase the birth of racially desirable Germans, though it is impossible to separate scientific pretense from the sheer sadism that marked every interaction. For the children, each session was an ordeal, hours of measurements, invasive procedures, and forced compliance. The psychological toll was immense, as they endured repeated humiliation and terror under the guise of medical examination. The ultimate horror of his experiments is captured in the accounts of those forced to witness them. Miklos Niisli, a pathologist coerced into assisting Mengel, testified that he saw 14 twins murdered in a single night. First sedated with Evapan to render them unconscious. The children were then killed with chloroform injections to the heart. Niisli later described the lingering smell of the chemical as he performed autopsies, all while fearing that his knowledge of these atrocities could cost him his own life. The twin experiments were not isolated incidents. They were deliberate, methodical, and executed with a terrifying precision that made the cruelty almost clinical, leaving a haunting legacy of suffering and death. Within the confines of Auschwitz, Mengel's cruelty was masked by an unsettling facade of care. His research subjects, particularly children, were housed separately from other prisoners, with slightly better food and living conditions. For a fleeting moment, this improved treatment offered them a false sense of safety, as they were temporarily spared the immediate threat of the gas chambers. Mengel would walk among his victims, handing out sweets and small comforts, earning the disturbing nickname Uncle Mengel from some of the children. Yet behind this veneer of kindness lurked an unimaginable terror. Those same children, whom he appeared to nurture and protect, could be condemned to death at any moment, their fates determined by his whims alone. Survivors and fellow prisoners often remarked on the terrifying duality of his character. On one hand, he seemed capable of small acts of generosity, bringing sugar, attending to minute details of the children's lives, even eliciting their affection. On the other hand, the smoke of the crematoria was never far away, and those very children could be sent there within hours. This juxtaposition, the blend of tenderness and unimaginable cruelty, was the hallmark of Mengel's reign of terror, a psychological manipulation that left both victims and witnesses in a state of constant dread and confusion. Mengel's experimentation extended to the human eye, where he conducted procedures designed to alter pigmentation. Collaborating with the biologist Karen Magnuson, he explored heterochromia, a condition in which a person has two different colored irises. Using chemical or hormonal drops, Mengel subjected prisoners' eyes to painful treatments, hoping to observe changes in pigmentation. While some have speculated that he sought to create Aryan features, researchers argue that his goal was not cosmetic but rather pseudoscientific, an attempt to study heredity and the biological basis of eye color under the guise of eugenics. The experiments often involved excruciating procedures. Eyes were removed from prisoners, sometimes from those who had been killed with lethal injections, and sent to laboratories in Berlin for study. Official accounts from collaborators after the war claimed that the specimens came from those who died naturally, but survivors like Measley reported the grim reality. Many had been deliberately killed to serve Mengel's research. Genealogical records were compiled alongside these experiments, documenting family histories and eye characteristics with obsessive precision. The combination of scientific pretense, cruelty, and systematic murder made his eye research not only a tool of pseudoscience, but a terrifying instrument of oppression and death. Not every story about Mengel's experiments is fully accurate. Over the years, historians have carefully examined the accounts and challenged some of the more sensational claims. Tales that have circulated, such as sewing twins together to create conjoined children, have been debunked as myths. Experts at the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum emphasize that such stories were likely exaggerated or distorted over time, often overshadowing the documented horrors that actually occurred. Similarly, other extreme claims, like attempting to surgically alter a child's urinary tract or performing cross-sex transformations through transfusions or changing eye color, have been largely dismissed by serious researchers. Historians like Paul Weinling note that while a range of cruel medical experiments took place during the Holocaust, many of the more lurid procedures have been incorrectly attributed to Mengel, when in fact they were carried out by other camp doctors. These clarifications do not lessen the terror of Mengel's true actions. While myths may circulate, the verified evidence of his twin experiments, racial studies, and medical tortures remains deeply disturbing. The line between rumor and fact highlights the need for careful historical examination, ensuring that the real suffering of his victims is accurately remembered, without distortion by exaggeration. As the Soviet forces closed in on Auschwitz in early 1945, Mengel abandoned the camp, taking with him a grim collection of his research, boxes of specimens, meticulously kept records, and notes that documented the atrocities he had committed. The SS had already destroyed most of the medical files in a desperate attempt to erase evidence. But Mengel ensured that some of his twisted legacy survived in his own hands. He briefly found himself stationed at Gross-Rosen concentration camp in Lower Silesia, only to flee again as the Red Army advanced, moving from camp to camp, possibly through Reichenau near Ryknov or one of the many subcamps of Gross-Rosen, each stop a temporary shelter from the tide of Allied liberation. His journey took him to Žatec in Czechoslovakia, where in a cruel twist of fate, he could wear the uniform of a Wehrmacht officer rather than the more infamous SS regalia, giving him a shield of camouflage as he continued to evade capture. Along the way, he entrusted incriminating documents to a nurse with whom he had formed a connection, leaving behind pieces of his dark past while maintaining his mobility in the collapsing Nazi apparatus. By June 1945, Mengel's careful planning had allowed him to fall into the hands of the Americans, who briefly took him as a prisoner of war. Despite being registered under his real name, the chaos of post-war administration meant that he escaped identification as a major war criminal. Without the distinctive SS blood group tattoo and armed with a convincing cover story that omitted any mention of Auschwitz, he convinced authorities he was just another soldier displaced by war. Within weeks, he was released, securing a false clearance certificate under the alias Fritz Ullmann, which he later modified to Fritz Hallmann, creating a legal identity that masked the horrors of his recent past. For the next few years, Mengel remained in hiding within Germany, drifting between temporary jobs and safe houses. He worked as a farmhand near Rosenheim, maintaining contact with select family members while ensuring that outsiders remained unaware of his presence. His wife acted as if he were dead, simultaneously negotiating with him over the possibility of divorce, while Mengel plotted his eventual departure from Europe. By April 1949, aware that his capture would almost certainly result in trial and execution, he prepared for a daring escape. Utilizing the network of former SS members who had orchestrated Ratlins across post-war Europe, Mengel made his way to Genoa, Italy, where the International Committee of the Red Cross issued him a passport under the name Helmut Greger. In July of that year, he boarded a ship bound for Argentina, leaving behind his homeland, his past life, and a family unable or unwilling to follow. His wife refused to accompany him, and their divorce was finalized by proxy in Dusseldorf in 1954, severing yet another connection to the world he had left behind in his flight from justice. After fleeing Europe, Mengel settled in Buenos Aires, blending into the bustling city under the radar of authorities hunting Nazi fugitives. At first, he found lodging in a modest boarding house in Vicente Lopez while working as a carpenter, a far cry from the twisted laboratory experiments he had conducted in Auschwitz. Within weeks, he moved into the home of a sympathetic Nazi supporter in Florida Este, a move that offered both safety and social cover. Soon, he reconnected with his family's business, Carl Mengel and Sons, taking up a role as a salesman for farm equipment. By 1951, his work required frequent trips to Paraguay, allowing him to move fluidly across South America while remaining beyond the reach of post-war investigators. Over the next few years, he expanded his personal and professional footprint, acquiring a part interest in a carpentry business, renting a suburban home in Olivos, and even possibly practicing medicine without a license, including performing abortions, according to Argentine government files released decades later. Each step was carefully calculated to maintain the facade of normalcy, while quietly hiding a past built on unspeakable crimes. In 1956, Mengel's meticulous planning enabled him to regain legal documentation that legitimized his existence abroad. Using a copy of his birth certificate obtained through the West German embassy, he secured a foreign residence permit in Argentina under his true name. With this, he obtained a West German passport and traveled back to Europe, reconnecting with family under a carefully constructed deception. His son, Rolf, was told that Mengel was his Uncle Fritz, and he also spent time with his widowed sister-in-law, Martha, on a ski holiday in Switzerland, even visiting his hometown of Günzburg. When he returned to Buenos Aires later that year, he obtained an Argentine identity card under the name Jose Mengel, a subtle variation on his real name, cementing a dual existence that allowed him to move freely between continents while keeping his war crimes obscured. By the late 1950s, Minjal had firmly entrenched himself in the social and business circles of Buenos Aires. He invested in a pharmaceutical company, Fadro Farm, while maintaining ties to family members who either did not know or chose to ignore his past. In 1958, authorities briefly questioned him and several other doctors following the death of a teenage girl after an abortion, a reminder of how close he was to exposure. But he was released without charges. Ever cautious, Minjal undertook extended business trips to Paraguay, each journey a strategic move to avoid scrutiny while continuing to oversee his growing business interests. Meanwhile, his family life continued in parallel. Martha and her son Karl Heinz lived with him, eventually traveling back to West Germany, then moving to Switzerland and Italy, leaving Minjal to navigate his complex web of deceit and survival in South America. Despite the end of World War II, Minjal's name lingered in the records of the Allied forces, whispered in courtrooms and documents alike. During the Nuremberg trials, his absence was noted repeatedly, yet investigators assumed he had perished in the chaos of post-war Europe. Even his own family in Günzburg, including his wife Irene, claimed that he was dead. But hidden from public view, Minjal was very much alive, weaving a new identity far from the shadows of Europe. In 1958, a seemingly innocuous letter surfaced. A woman who had read a biography of Anne Frank relayed that a maid from the Minjal household claimed he was in South America, supposedly working as a doctor. This tip reached German prosecutors, setting the gears of justice in motion, even as Minjal quietly moved between countries to stay one step ahead of those seeking him. By early 1959, German authorities issued an arrest warrant, but by then, Minjal may have even briefly returned to West Germany to see his ailing father, a risky move for a man living under the illusion of safety abroad. Meanwhile, Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal and Hermann Langbein tirelessly pieced together Minjal's trail. They interviewed witnesses, combed through wartime records, and tracked public documents, eventually discovering his divorce papers listing a Buenos Aires address. These discoveries sparked a new wave of pressure on West Germany to pursue extradition. On June 5, 1959, a second, more detailed arrest warrant was issued, now documenting his wartime atrocities. West Germany even offered a reward for his capture, but bureaucratic delays and Minjal's cunning meant he remained free. Argentina initially refused to extradite him, citing his disappearance from the listed residence, giving Minjal crucial time to slip across the border into Paraguay, where he secured a quiet life on a farm in Jojino, near the Argentine frontier. There, he adopted the alias Francisco Fischer and reportedly worked as a veterinary surgeon, carefully masking his identity while blending into rural life. Minjal's move to Paraguay marked the start of a new chapter of careful survival. Before leaving Argentina, he liquidated his shares in Fadro Farm, entrusting his wife Martha with power of attorney to handle legal and financial matters in his absence. By May 1959, he had formally obtained Paraguayan citizenship under the name Jose Minjal. Yet even this new layer of protection was temporary. The dramatic capture of Adolf Eichmann in May 1960 sent shockwaves through the network of Nazis hiding in South America, demonstrating that safe havens could vanish overnight. Recognizing the increased risk, Minjal quietly relocated to Brazil, assuming yet another alias, Peter Hochbichler, thanks to connections like Hans Ulrich Rudel. In October 1960, he crossed into Brazil, a man continually reinventing himself, yet never escaping the legacy of the crimes he had committed decades earlier. His Paraguayan citizenship was eventually annulled in August 1979, a symbolic but ultimately ineffective measure against the fugitive who had long since vanished into the shadows of South America. After crossing into Brazil, Minjal found temporary refuge on a farm near Sao Paulo owned by a sympathizer of former Nazis, Wolfgang Gerhard. Gerhard not only provided shelter, but also helped him navigate the treacherous journey across borders, ensuring he remained under the radar. In 1961, Minjal moved again, this time to a farm in Nova Europa, where Hungarian expatriates Gaza and Gitta Stammer took him in. With funds provided by Minjal, the group invested in a coffee and cattle farm in Serra Negra the following year. with Mengele holding a half share in the property. Initially, the Stammers believed Mengele was someone named Peter Hochbichler, but by 1963, they had uncovered his true identity. Fearing legal repercussions for harboring a fugitive, Gerhard convinced them to keep his presence a secret. By that same year, Brazilian authorities requested a detailed dossier from Argentina regarding Mengele, a file over 100 pages long, though its contents remained largely inaccessible to the public. Meanwhile, efforts to capture Mengele at an international level were already underway. In the months following Adolf Eichmann's capture in Buenos Aires in 1960, Israeli intelligence director Isser Harel had hoped to extend the operation to apprehend Mengele as well. Eichmann revealed safe houses and addresses used by Nazi fugitives, but surveillance failed to turn up Mengele, and even letters sent to his real name provided no trace of his movements. A later investigation at a workshop where Mengele had been a part owner also yielded nothing. By early 1961, West Germany formally expanded its extradition request to include Brazil, having learned from Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal that Mengele may have relocated there. Mossad agent Zvi Aharoni was tasked with leading the effort to locate him. His team followed Gerhard to a rural area near Sao Paulo and identified a European man they believed could be Mengele. Despite this promising lead, operational challenges, including limited resources, the complexity of the capture, and shifting international priorities, forced Mossad to suspend the search in 1962. Mengele, as always, remained one step ahead, blending into the rural landscape while the world continued to hunt him. By the mid-1960s, Israeli intelligence had intensified efforts to locate Mengele. In 1964, Meir Amit, then head of Mossad, authorized a covert operation targeting the apartment of Mengele's estranged wife, Martha, in Bavaria. When agents finally conducted searches in 1966 and again in 1967, they found no concrete evidence of communication between her and Mengele. However, intercepted conversations suggested the two were still in contact. In a bid to gather more information, the Mossad tried to involve Martha's boyfriend, a dentist named Siegfried Peretta, with an agent posing as a patient visiting his practice. But this effort also yielded nothing. Listening devices were eventually removed from Martha's apartment in October 1967, and by the end of 1968, Israel had scaled back its active hunt for Nazi fugitives. The search lay dormant until 1977, when the government of München began revived efforts, focusing particularly on Mengele. New operations included surveillance of his son Rolf and attempts to coax him into revealing his father's location. Yet these moves failed to produce results. Meanwhile, Mengele continued his life in Brazil. In 1969, he and the Stammers purchased a farmhouse in Caieiras, with Mengele holding a half interest. By 1971, Wolfgang Gerhard, who had assisted Mengele during his flight from justice, returned to Germany and entrusted Mengele with his identification papers, which he would use to move freely under an assumed identity. Relations with the Stammers deteriorated in the mid-1970s, and when they bought a new home in Sao Paulo, Mengele was no longer part of their household. Instead, he rented a small bungalow in Diadema, Sao Paulo, from the Stammers. In 1977, Rolf Mengele visited his father for the first time since their ski holiday in 1956, encountering a man who remained unapologetic about his past, insisting he had merely performed his duties as an officer. Mengele's health, however, was in decline. He suffered from a stroke in 1976, along with high blood pressure and an ear infection that affected his balance. On February 7, 1979, while swimming at a coastal resort in Bertioga at the home of friends Wolfram and Lieselot Bossert, he suffered a second stroke and drowned. His body was interred at Our Lady of the Rosary Cemetery in Embu das Artes under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, one of the false identities he had been using since 1971. Over the years, Mengele had employed several other aliases, including Dr. Fausto Rindon and S. Yossi Alvarez Espaillo, successfully eluding justice until his death. In the decades after World War II, sightings of Mengele surfaced across the globe. Simon Wiesenthal claimed to have tracked him to the Greek island of Kythnos in 1960, to Cairo in 1961, to Spain in 1971, and even to Paraguay in 1978, long after he had fled the country. Interest in capturing him remained high. In 1982, Wiesenthal offered a reward of $100,000, roughly $300,000 in today's money, and as late as 1985, he insisted that Minjal was still alive. That year, a mock trial held in Jerusalem drew international attention, featuring testimonies from over 100 survivors of Minjal's experiments. The event spurred a coordinated effort by the West German, Israeli, and U.S. governments to locate him, with each offering rewards, as did organizations such as the Washington Times and the Simon Wiesenthal Center. On May 31, 1985, a breakthrough came when West German authorities, acting on intelligence, raided the home of Hans Sedlmayr, a lifelong friend of Minjal and a manager in the family company in Gunzburg. Among his papers, investigators discovered a coded address book and letters sent to and from Minjal. Most crucially, a letter from Wolfram Bossert informed Sedlmayr of Minjal's death. German authorities alerted Sao Paulo police, who then contacted the Bosserts. The couple disclosed the location of Minjal's grave, and on June 6, 1985, his remains were exhumed. Forensic analysis strongly indicated that the body belonged to Minjal, a conclusion later corroborated by his son Rolf, who confirmed on June 10 that the remains were indeed his father's. The concealment of the death had been intended to protect those who had sheltered him during his years in hiding. In 1992, DNA testing conclusively verified Minjal's identity. Despite repeated requests from Brazilian authorities to return the remains to Germany, the family declined. Today, his skeleton is kept at the Sao Paulo Institute for Forensic Medicine, where it serves as an educational resource for students of forensic medicine at the University of Sao Paulo. In 2007, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum received a remarkable donation known as the Hocker Album, a collection of photographs showing the staff at Auschwitz, including several images of Minjal himself. Years later, in February 2010, a 180-page volume of Minjal's personal diary surfaced at auction through Alexander Autographs. The buyer, whose identity was undisclosed, was reported to be the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. The previous owner had obtained the diaries in Brazil and was said to have close ties to the Minjal family. The sale drew criticism from Holocaust survivor organizations, who condemned it as a cynical attempt to profit from the writings of one of history's most notorious criminals. Rabbi Marvin Heer of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, however, expressed relief that the diary had ended up in the hands of someone connected to the Jewish community, emphasizing its historical importance. On the centenary of Minjal's birth in 2011, another 31 volumes of his diaries were sold by the same auction house, again to an undisclosed collector, for a reported $245,000. The sale sparked protests from survivors and historians who objected to the commercialization of documents tied to such atrocities.